They said the devil came in the night, but it was only a woman carrying water and hope. Welcome, seekers of truth and silence. Tonight we open a forgotten book, one whose pages were burned, one whose ink was written in blood. This is not the story of witches, not truly. It is the story of women who held the power to give life and were punished for it. This is the forgotten midwives of Europe. In the age before doctors wore white and before hospitals smelled of disinfectant and fear, there were midwives, women who worked by candlelight, guided by instinct and the rhythms of the earth. They learned not from books, but from hands and heartbeats, from the soft sighs of mothers and the cries of newborns. They carried herbs instead of crosses, oils instead of relics, and for that they were feared. In villages across Europe, Germany, Scotland, France, Bohemia, when a woman went into labor, her husband would run through the streets calling for the wise one, the herb mother, the moon hand. These were the midwives. They came in the dark, cloaked not in sin, but in duty. They brought water to wash, cloth to swaddle, prayers whispered to both God and nature. Their hands smelled of lavender and smoke. Their faces were lined with knowledge. They knew when to cut, when to wait, when to comfort. They knew the pulse of both life and death. And that, the church decided, was too much power for any woman to hold. It began with whispers. A baby born under a full moon, unnatural, they said. A mother surviving a difficult birth, miraculous or perhaps diabolical. A woman healing the sick when priests' prayers failed, suspicious. In time, healing became heresy. The church, desperate to reassert authority in a world trembling between plague and superstition, began to look at these women not as saviors, but as threats. Why, the inquisitors asked, does she know the secrets of blood and bone when men do not? They had their answer ready, because she was taught by the devil. And so began the long night. Records from the 15th century tell us that in some regions, entire generations of midwives vanished. In the German Hexenhammer, the witch hammer, their descriptions are unmistakable. Women who meddle in childbirth, who use herbs and whispers instead of prayers, who speak of healing rather than suffering, these serve not Christ, but the serpent. Imagine it, a small cottage at the edge of a frost-bitten forest. Inside, a woman kneels beside a mother in pain. She wipes sweat from her brow, murmurs words her grandmother taught her, not spells, but comfort. She burns sage, ties a red ribbon to ward off fear. The baby arrives, silent at first, then crying. Relief floods the room. And then a knock. Men in robes. Men with torches, men who have never seen birth but believe they own it. By whose power did you summon life? They ask. By God's, she replies. Then why did you not call his name? I did, but I also called my mother's. They drag her outside. Her herbs are trampled, her linens burned. The baby, still slick with life, is left crying in the cold. For centuries, this scene repeated itself across Europe. Tens of thousands of women accused, tortured, executed. The official charge was witchcraft. The real crime was knowledge. Yet not all who condemned them were cruel. Some believed they were saving souls. Others simply feared what they could not control. In a world where disease struck like lightning, where childbirth was a gamble with death, the line between miracle and blasphemy blurred easily. And so, the wise women learned to hide. They worked in silence, behind walls, under false names. They baptized infants in secret, brewed medicine for the sick, whispered blessings over the dying. They passed their knowledge not in books, but in lullabies, stories, and the careful folding of herbs. Every generation buried a little more of what they knew. And yet, something survived. Because life always finds a way to remember those who served it. The smell of rosemary still clings to birth rooms. The old songs mothers hum to their newborns still carry the rhythm of the midwives' prayers. And the modern word doctor, derived from docere, meaning to teach, once belonged to them. Before men studied medicine in marble halls, women practiced it by moonlight. They were not witches, they were memory itself. So when the flames rose, when the crowd shouted, "Heretic," they were not burning evil, they were burning knowledge. They were burning the hands that caught the moon. And though the ashes scattered, the scent of herbs lingered. Because truth, like birth, cannot be stopped by fire.
They said it was written to defend faith, but in truth, it was written to destroy women. Welcome back, seekers of the forbidden past. Tonight we turn the page to one of history's darkest texts, a book that weaponized scripture, cloaked cruelty in holiness, and gave terror the shape of law. This is The Hammer and the Womb, the story of the book that taught Europe how to burn its midwives. It began in 1486, in a world trembling between plague and salvation. The church was losing its grip. Science whispered of the earth revolving around the sun. Women whispered of healing herbs that worked better than prayer. And in a time when fear was the only thing people trusted, two men offered a solution: find someone to blame. Their names were Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Springer, Dominican inquisitors, theologians, servants of the church. Their creation would become infamous: Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It was not the first book to condemn magic, but it was the first to do so with obsession. Its pages trembled with hatred disguised as logic, paranoia dressed as theology. It declared that witchcraft was not merely sin, it was womanhood corrupted. All witchcraft, they wrote, comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. They claimed women were weaker in faith, stronger in flesh, that the devil found easy purchase in their hearts, that every miscarriage, every storm, every dying cow could be traced to a woman who whispered too softly in the dark. But beneath the fire and fury lay something more specific, more sinister. The Malleus singled out midwives. It accused them of killing infants, of offering newborns to demons, of using childbirth to bind women's souls to the devil. No creature, it said, does more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives.
Why midwives? Because they stood at the threshold of life and death, because they held power the church could not control, and because in the candlelit hours of labor, when blood and prayer mingled, women turned to each other, not to priests. The inquisitors saw it as rebellion. They mistook compassion for conspiracy. Soon, the Malleus became the most popular book in Europe after the Bible. It was copied by hand, whispered in cathedrals, quoted in trials. Wherever it went, fire followed. In Germany, women who helped with births were dragged from their homes, tortured until they confessed impossible crimes. In Switzerland, inquisitors demanded the names of every woman who had touched a newborn. In Scotland, midwives were forced to testify against each other, one whisper enough to ignite a pyre. Imagine a courtroom lit by torchlight. A woman stands trembling, her apron stained with ash and milk. A judge reads from the Malleus, voice echoing in the cold stone hall. "She who aids in birth without priestly sanction traffics with Satan himself." The crowd murmurs. The smell of burning tallow thickens the air. Her hands, those same hands that once cradled life, are bound for death. But not all bowed to the hammer. In secret, other women preserved what knowledge they could. They buried herbal recipes in walls, encoded remedies in embroidery, hid warnings in lullabies. Some even disguised themselves as nuns or healers sanctioned by the church, masking their craft beneath Latin prayers.
In their silence, they became the first scientists, the keepers of empirical truth in a world ruled by dogma. And yet, history forgot their names. We remember the inquisitors who wrought their deaths, not the midwives who saved lives. We quote the Malleus, but not the hands that defied it. Even today, the shadows of that book linger. The suspicion of women's knowledge, the fear of bodies that bleed and heal, the idea that power held by women must somehow be sin. But knowledge does not burn forever. For every copy of the Malleus that turned to ash, another truth survived, in whispered words passed through centuries of mothers and daughters. We bring life, not darkness. It was their quiet defiance that carried medicine through the Middle Ages into the modern world. And as for Kramer and Springer, the authors of Fear, history played its quiet revenge. Both men died consumed by paranoia, shunned even by their peers. One begged for forgiveness on his deathbed. The other vanished, unrecorded. The hammer they forged eventually shattered, but the scars it left remained carved into history's flesh. They said the flames purified souls, but those fires were built not for sin, they were built for silence. Welcome back, wanderers of truth. Tonight we walk into the heart of the storm, into the century when Europe learned to fear its women, and churches learned to preach with smoke. This is the Fire Sermons, when the voice of the pulpit became the roar of a pyre.
It began in the 16th century, when plague and famine turned faith into panic. The old world, the world of saints and relics, of small chapels and whispered prayers, was dying. But instead of compassion, the church offered suspicion. Instead of mercy, it offered fire. Across Germany, Switzerland, France, and Scotland, preachers climbed into wooden pulpits and thundered about the devil's brides. They spoke not of salvation, but contagion. They told their trembling congregations that witches walked among them, women who stole infants in the night, who soured milk, who whispered storms into being. And the people believed them, because belief in the age of fear spreads faster than truth. The sermons always began the same way, calm, then crescendo. The priest's voice rising over the murmurs of the crowd, his hands shaking as he read from Scripture, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a man certain of his holiness. The witch hides among us. She wears the face of your neighbor, your wife, your midwife. She smiles while she serves, but her soul belongs to Satan. The congregation gasped, crossed themselves, wept, and in that trembling awe the preacher's power grew. In time, every illness, every failed harvest, every stillbirth became evidence of witchcraft. And those who had once been the guardians of life, the midwives, the healers, became the first to be accused. In Bavaria, a woman named Greta Lang, known for saving mothers during plague, was dragged before a priest because 3 children in her village had died of fever. In Scotland, Agnes Murdoch, who used willow bark to ease pain, was tortured until she confessed to raising storms. In France, Jean de Loup, who helped the poor for free, was burned alive for pride against God.
But their stories were not unique. The sermons turned neighbor against neighbor, husband against wife, daughter against mother. To burn one witch, the priest said, is to save 100 souls. The church gave it a name, auto da fe, the act of faith. The people gave it another, justice. And so the flames spread. Picture a square at dusk, the sky bruised purple, the crowd thick with breath and red. At the center, a woman bound to a stake, her eyes wide, not with fear, but disbelief. She had delivered half the children standing there. She had washed their mothers, healed their wounds, fed their poor. Now those same people watch as the torch touches the kindling. A murmur becomes a roar. The smell of burning hair mingles with the scent of herbs hidden in her pockets. A scream breaks through the hymns, and then only the crackle of fire. And above it all, the preacher's voice. See how swiftly the devil flees from the righteous flame. They called it faith, but what burned that night was knowledge, compassion, and the memory of a time when healing belonged to women. The fire sermons became theater. Towns competed to purge sin. In some villages, inquisitors sold indulgences, payment to guarantee your safety from accusation. The poor paid with coin. The women paid with their lives. Yet amid the terror, something strange began to happen. The very rituals the church condemned, the herbs, the prayers, the moonlit blessings, refused to die. Farmers still whispered the old words over their sick children. Mothers still rubbed rosemary on door frames. Even some priests secretly kept potions hidden beneath their robes. Because deep down, everyone knew the witches were not devils. They were necessary.
Even fire could not erase that truth. By the early 17th century, Europe's skies were gray with the smoke of its own fear. The sermons had done their work. Tens of thousands of women, healers, midwives, widows, and dreamers turned to ash. The pulpit had become the pyre, and faith had devoured itself. But still, in the silence that followed, the whispers began again. Some said that on nights when the wind carried the smell of burning, you could still hear the midwives singing, lullabies in languages older than Scripture. They called it haunting, but it was really remembrance. They said the witches had vanished, but the truth is, they learned to breathe like smoke. Seen only when the light was right, felt only when the wind remembered. Welcome back, seekers of the silenced. Tonight we cross the cold seas of superstition to the mist-cloaked lands of the north. Scotland, the Orkney Isles, Scandinavia, where the witch fires still burned, but where the hunted learned to endure. This is the Daughters of Smoke, the story of survival written in whispers, in wind, and in the quiet strength of women who refused to vanish. By the dawn of the 17th century, the witch hunts had become routine. Trials were held in marketplaces. Hangings followed Sunday Mass. It was no longer about sin, it was entertainment, spectacle, control. But even in this age of fear, resistance took root, fragile and unseen, like herbs growing through cracks in stone. The women called themselves the Daughters of Smoke.
They were midwives, widows, herbalists, and healers, scattered across Scotland and northern Europe. Those who had escaped the noose or the pyre by wit or by mercy. They met in secret, not in forests or caves as legend claims, but in cottages, by riverbanks, in the shadow of ruins. They shared knowledge like smuggled treasure. One would bring dried yarrow from the highlands for fever. Another would teach how to stop bleeding with spider silk and nettle. A third would carry herbs hidden in the hems of her dress, trading them for bread or news. And always they remembered the names of the burned. They did not speak them aloud, but each healing, each birth, each life saved was an act of remembrance, a defiance. In one village near Aberdeen, a midwife named Ellen McCrae delivered more than 40 children during a single winter. When inquisitors came demanding she renounce her craft, she smiled and said, "Then who will deliver your sons when their wives scream for mercy?" She was never touched. Even fear needs its healers. In Norway, the daughters found refuge in the fjords, where the mountains kept their secrets. There, women gathered herbs by moonlight, pretending to collect firewood. The locals whispered that ghosts guided them. In truth, it was older knowledge, a lineage of care passed through generations before the church claimed ownership of medicine. In Denmark, they hid their wisdom in songs. Lullabies became recipes. Verses became instructions. A child singing before bed might unknowingly recite how to treat fever, soothe pain, or stop bleeding. "Sleep, little one, sleep, and may thyme guard your dreams, rosemary your breath, and love your waking." To the untrained ear, it was just a melody. To the initiated, it was survival. In Germany's Black Forest, where the witch hunts began, the last of the daughters worked under the guise of convent nurses. They healed soldiers wounded by wars of religion, men who condemned them by day and begged for their touch by night. In hidden chambers, they taught anatomy to younger sisters, carving lessons into wooden bowls, then burning the shavings to hide the evidence. The Daughters of Smoke did not fight with swords or sermons. Their rebellion was quieter, older, and infinitely harder to destroy. It was the rebellion of care. Each act of healing was resistance. Each herb brewed was a declaration that life still belonged to women as much as to men. Each newborn held was a reminder that no doctrine could own creation. But the Church could not stand what it could not see. In 1661, in the village of Eyemouth, Scotland, a priest named Father Dougal Kerr began preaching against the whispering women. He claimed they met with demons on the cliffs, that they turned storms against ships, that they stole newborns with their rituals. He was not entirely wrong. The daughters did meet on the cliffs, but not to summon storms. They met to save sailors from drowning, throwing ropes from the rocks, nursing the survivors in secret. When one of those men betrayed them to the church, Father Kerr led the witch-finders himself. What he found was not a coven, but a hospice.
women tending wounds, drying blankets, feeding orphans. But fear does not need evidence, only spectacle. 3 of the daughters were taken, 2 burned.
The third, Ellen Machrie's daughter, Mara, escaped into the sea, clutching a small bag of herbs. Witnesses said the tide turned red that night. The priest said it was divine wrath, but the fishermen whispered that the sea took her gently, like a mother reclaiming her child. In the years that followed, sightings of the sea midwife spread along the coast. An apparition seen at night when storms threatened ships, a woman wading through the waves carrying a lantern. Wherever she appeared, no one drowned. Superstition turned her into legend, but legend has a way of keeping truth alive. By the 18th century, the witch hunts had begun to fade. Enlightenment scholars scoffed at superstition, declaring reason victorious. But the women who had lived through the terror knew better. They knew that what had been called witchcraft was simply the knowledge of life, the first medicine, the first mercy. They passed their craft to the next generation quietly, not as spells, but as midwifery, herbalism, and nursing. The word witch was buried, but the practice survived. The daughters of smoke became nurses, doctors, healers, the unseen foundation of modern medicine. And yet, in the highlands, in the mist, in the rhythm of the sea, they say the wind still carries the faintest scent of thyme and myrrh. A reminder, a memory. Because the daughters of the fire did not die in the flames. They turned into smoke, and smoke, as every hunter learns, can never be caught.
They said knowledge was salvation, but for women, it became the sharpest blade. Welcome back, seekers of the untold. Tonight, we enter the so-called Age of Reason, a time when superstition bowed to science, and the fire of witch hunts dimmed into the cold light of laboratories. Yet beneath this new light, the old fear lingered. This is the anatomy of fear, when the men of medicine rose from the ashes of the women they condemned. By the 18th century, the fires had died down. Europe congratulated itself on being civilized, enlightened, rational. The word witch faded from sermons and law books, but something subtle had replaced it, another way to erase women from the story of healing. For centuries, the body had been forbidden to study. The church once called dissection sacrilege, the cutting of flesh an insult to God. But after the witch hunts ended, universities reopened the human body, not to those who had known it for generations, but to those who had destroyed them. The midwives were gone. The physicians arrived. In the lecture halls of London, Paris, and Vienna, young men gathered around cold tables where the dead were opened like books. They called it science. They called it progress. But their hands trembled with the same old hunger to control what they feared. They studied birth as if it were a battlefield. They spoke of the uterus as the enemy organ, of women as unpredictable vessels of chaos. Their textbooks never mentioned the midwives who had mastered childbirth long before anatomy had a name. In one London hospital, a doctor marveled at how the female body conceals its own design. He was wrong. It did not conceal. He simply never asked the right people.
While these men wrote theories about women's bodies, the real knowledge, the kind that saved lives, still survived in whispers. In the countryside, women still helped each other give birth. They used the same herbs, the same prayers, the same patience their ancestors had risked their lives to preserve. But now, the danger came not from inquisitors, but from law. By the 1750s, midwifery was declared unlicensed practice. The same church that had once burned them now joined hands with universities to outlaw them. In Paris, midwives could be arrested for interference in medical matters. In London, they were fined for using herbal remedies without approval. The ancient art of birth had become a profession, and only men could hold the title doctor. It was not science that ended the witch hunts. It was science that continued them by other means. The irony was cruel. The new doctors who filled the hospitals learned their techniques from the stolen notebooks of midwives. They took credit for discoveries that women had known for centuries. They learned how to stop bleeding using cobwebs and honey. They learned the use of willow bark for pain, of chamomile for fever, of belladonna for muscle contractions. They renamed them pharmacology. And when their patients died, as many did, they called it progress. The bodies of women became laboratories, dissected, measured, recorded, erased. Their suffering was data. Their silence was required. In 1793, during the French Revolution, a midwife named Madeleine Bertrand dared to open a birthing house for the poor, teaching other women the art of safe delivery. She was accused of medical sedition. Her instruments were confiscated. Her students were imprisoned. The irony? A year later, her techniques saved the life of a noblewoman under the care of a male surgeon. He received a medal.
She disappeared. But knowledge, once born, never truly dies. In secret, women continued to learn from each other, in convents, in kitchens, in the dim corners of hospitals where men never looked. They studied anatomy through practice, not diagrams. They whispered the truth that the body was not a battlefield, but a home. And slowly, the world began to shift. The age of glass and reason gave birth to a new kind of healer, the nurse. Women once burned for touching the sick now wore uniforms sanctioned by the same institutions that had silenced them. Yet even in this newfound respect, their ancient wisdom was never acknowledged. Every pulse taken, every wound washed, every birth attended, all of it descended from those same witches who once worked by candlelight. They had been written out of textbooks, but they lingered in the muscle memory of care. The doctors drew their diagrams. The midwives' ghosts held the scalpel. So, when we speak of enlightenment, we must ask, who held the torch, and whose bodies burned to light the way? They said the new age was clean, but they forgot that sterility can kill too. Welcome back, seekers of the untold. Tonight, we step into the pale light of the 19th century, a world of polished hospitals, white linens, and men in coats who claimed to have tamed death. Yet, beneath their cleanliness, the old fear still pulsed, raw and red. This is the White Plague and the Red Hands, when the pursuit of purity turned healing into horror, and the ghosts of the midwives returned in silence. The old Europe of smoke and superstition was gone. The world now belonged to science, or so it believed.
In the grand hospitals of Vienna, London, and Paris, the word progress hung like incense. Doctors in spotless coats moved through corridors gleaming with white tile, their faces proud, their hands unwashed. They called themselves saviors, men of reason, men who had replaced myth with method, yet their patients still died. Childbirth had moved from homes to hospitals, and what was once a ritual guided by women's touch had become a sterile procedure,
ruled by men who spoke of anatomy but ignored instinct. Women who had given birth in their own beds for centuries were now strapped to metal tables, surrounded by strangers with cold instruments and colder eyes. They called it advancement, but the mothers called it cruelty. At the heart of this new medicine lay a tragedy of arrogance. In Vienna, a young physician named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something disturbing. Women who gave birth attended by doctors died in greater numbers than those attended by midwives. The cause seemed invisible, but the pattern was undeniable. He discovered the truth. The doctors performed autopsies in the morning, then delivered babies without washing their hands. The infection that killed mothers after childbirth, puerperal fever, was not divine punishment. It was filth. It was neglect. Semmelweis begged his colleagues to wash. He brought water, soap, and vinegar into the wards. He pleaded, "The cause is not mystery, it is matter." But the doctors laughed. Washing was a woman's duty, not a man's. The irony was bitter. For centuries, women had been punished for using herbs and water to cleanse. Now, when science rediscovered what they had always known, it was met with scorn, because it came from a man, but smelled like a woman's wisdom. Semmelweis was ridiculed, dismissed, and driven mad. The hospitals continued to kill their patients in the name of progress, and the midwives, now barred from practice, watched helplessly as death claimed the very women they once protected. It was the age of sterility, but not yet of safety. The obsession with cleanliness grew into a cult. The new doctors believed that anything natural, blood, milk, touch, was corruption. They replaced herbs with chemicals, fire with acid, compassion with procedure. The birthing rooms that once smelled of lavender and smoke now reeked of ether and fear. Women began to disappear behind curtains. Their pain became something to be studied, not soothed. And if they cried too loudly, they were given chloroform to silence them. Science, like the church before it, found new ways to punish women for suffering too humanly. Meanwhile, outside the cities, the last of the traditional midwives still worked in secret. They could not compete with hospitals, but they remained the only hope for the poor. They had no diplomas, no sterile instruments, only hands and faith. Their work was forbidden, their presence was mocked, but their survival was essential. In the Scottish Highlands, in the mountains of Wales, in the villages of France and Bohemia, midwives still carried their small satchels of herbs and cloth. When the doctors failed, families called them back in secret. A woman named Bridget O'Fallon, an Irish midwife, once wrote in her journal, "They say I am unclean, yet my mothers live. They say they are holy, yet theirs die." She died in poverty, buried in an unmarked grave. 100 years later, her recipes for poultices would be recognized by modern medicine as antiseptics. The red hands of the midwives had been condemned for centuries, but those same hands carried the truth of life that the whitecoats had to rediscover through pain. By the late 1800s, medicine began to change again. Pasteur proved what women had always suspected, that sickness could live in unseen places. The germ replaced the devil. Infection replaced sin. And so the world finally began to wash. But even as science claimed victory, it forgot to give credit. The ghosts of the burned, the drowned, the silenced midwives, those women who scrubbed their hands in river water and called it prayer, were erased from the story. The hospitals became temples of modern faith. Doctors were the new priests, and women, once again, were the vessels. Spoken about, not spoken to. Yet something ancient lingered beneath the white walls. The faint scent of rosemary, the echo of whispered songs,
the memory of red hands that caught life before it fell. Because no matter how white the walls became, the truth of birth could never be sterilized. They said the future belonged to men with machines, but in the shadow of those machines, women began to build something stronger, a memory that refused to rust. Welcome back, seekers of the untold. Tonight, we step into the dawn of the 20th century, an age of smoke, steel, corsets, and courage. The world was changing faster than it could understand itself. But among the clang of factories and the roar of progress, another revolution stirred. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. This is the Daughters of Dust and Steel, the story of the women who reclaimed the art of healing from the ashes of witchcraft and the grip of patriarchy.
The 1900s arrived like a storm. Cities grew tall and dark, their skies stained with soot. Trains screamed across continents, electric light banished night. And in that artificial brightness, the old ways seemed irrelevant, buried beneath science, industry, and the noise of modernity. But history is patient. It hides in the hands of those who still remember. In the hospitals of London and New York, a new kind of woman appeared. She wore not silk, but starch, not jewels, but a cross of brass or a pin of silver. She walked the wards with confidence, her hair pinned back, her posture upright. She was the nurse, the heir of the burned. They said she served doctors, but in truth, she served life. From Florence Nightingale to Clara Barton, from Mary Seacole to the nameless midwives who cleaned blood from birthing beds, women returned to the front lines of care. They did not call themselves witches or healers, but their hands remembered the rhythm of the old world. Florence Nightingale carried a lamp through the night during the Crimean War, her light flickering over wounded men. Soldiers called her the lady with the lamp. They said her touch was divine. They did not know that her prayers were the same whispered invocations the midwives had murmured centuries earlier, calling on the balance between blood and breath, life and loss. Mary Seacole, the Jamaican nurse who treated cholera with herbs her mother taught her to use, was mocked by doctors until her remedies saved hundreds. The men called it luck, but she knew better. She had learned her medicine from women who were once called obia, a word whispered in fear, meaning witch. History had come full circle. The same knowledge once condemned as heresy now wore the badge of medicine. The difference? It was no longer allowed to be called women's wisdom. Industrialization changed everything. Machines began to regulate time, temperature, and even breath. Hospitals became factories of healing, efficient, ordered, mechanical. The nurse became both angel and servant, praised for her compassion, but denied her authority.
Still, she persisted. In Glasgow, a group of women calling themselves the Ladies of the Red Cross began training others to treat battlefield wounds. They studied anatomy in secret, using smuggled diagrams and dead animals when no cadavers were available. In their hidden classrooms, they whispered the same mantra their ancestors had spoken in the forests. We learn to save, not to be saved. In America, the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania opened its doors to female doctors. Scandalous, unthinkable. Male physicians called them unnatural. But the women kept coming. Some were arrested for practicing without permission. Others were banned from hospitals. A few, like Elizabeth Blackwell, forced their way into the profession by sheer will. The first women to stand in lecture halls built to exclude them. And what did they study? Anatomy, obstetrics, and childbirth. The forbidden sciences of the witches. The cycle was complete. The midwives had been burned. Their daughters were baptized in science. But beneath the lab coats and formal oaths, something of the old fire remained. An instinct, a compassion that could not be taught in universities. World War I made them indispensable. Millions of men died in trenches, but millions more lived because women learned to heal without sleep or safety. They carried stretchers, stitched wounds, boiled instruments, delivered children in bomb shelters. The doctors wrote reports. The women kept the world alive. And yet, after the wars ended, they were told to return home, to give back their uniforms, to marry, to mother, to disappear again. But they had already seen too much. They had walked through fire and lived. They had touched death and returned. They had remembered what their foremothers had whispered, that healing was not service, it was sovereignty. In 1923, a nurse named Helena Straub wrote in her journal, "We are not angels. We are not witches. We are what the world made and feared, women who understand the body." By mid-century, the witch hunts were long forgotten in the public mind, but their echo lived in language, in law, in the unspoken hierarchy of medicine. Doctors were still male. Nurses were still female.
Power had changed hands, but not balance. And yet, under the hum of electric lights, in wards that smelled of disinfectant instead of sage, the lineage endured. Every time a nurse stayed awake beside a dying man, every time a woman delivered a child alone and unafraid, every time a healer used touch instead of fear, the forgotten midwives lived again. They no longer needed covens or cauldrons. Their strength had become ordinary, invisible, woven into the structure of the modern world. They were not witches anymore. They were humanity's pulse, steady, quiet, eternal. And the dust they rose from had become steel. They said the past was buried, but bones remember. And when the earth forgets, women dig. Welcome back, seekers of the silenced. Tonight, we step into the century that tried to move on, the world of white hospitals, electric light, and progress without memory. But ghosts have long memories. This is the anatomy of memory, the story of how the descendants of the midwives unearthed the truth that history tried to sterilize. By the mid-20th century, Europe had rebuilt itself. The wars were over. The machines hummed again. Medicine had conquered infections, hunger, and pain, or so it claimed. Doctors walked through hallways that gleamed like cathedrals, believing they had exorcised superstition forever. But something was missing. The hospitals were efficient, yet cold. The bodies survived, but the souls went numb. The world had learned how to heal flesh, but forgotten how to touch with meaning. And then, in quiet corners of universities, women began to remember. It started with the historians, young scholars, daughters of nurses and midwives, reading between the lines of old archives. They found fragments, trial records, parish notes, confessions written under torture. Thousands of names, thousands of women. One Inquisition document read, "She assisted in birth and spoke to the child before the priest arrived." Another, "She used herbs without approval." Another still, "She knew the moment a child would be born, and therefore she must be of the devil." They realized something terrifying.
The witch hunts had not been superstition alone. They were systematic, organized, methodical. The first eradication not of sin, but of knowledge. The historians began to call them what they truly were, Europe's forgotten scientists. In 1973, a book titled Witches, Midwives, and Nurses emerged from the feminist presses. Its authors, Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English, declared what no one had dared say aloud, that the witch hunts were not only about religion or fear, but about the destruction of women's medical authority. For the first time in centuries, the silence cracked. The women of the 20th century, artists, scholars, mothers, activists, began to connect the dots between the burned healers of the past and the forgotten caregivers of the present. The nurses who worked long hours without recognition, the midwives still dismissed as folk practitioners, the doctors who faced ridicule for daring to wear a woman's nameplate on their office doors. The ghosts of the past were no longer shadows. They had become voices. In the 1960s and 70s, the feminist movement marched not only for equality, but for remembrance. Women carried banners that read, "We are the daughters of the witches you could not burn." It was not just a slogan, it was a truth reclaimed. Workshops emerged where women studied herbal medicine again, not as rebellion, but as reconnection. Feminist collectives in London and Berlin opened women's health centers offering childbirth classes that honored both science and instinct. They burned sage, not a superstition, but a ceremony. They lit candles, not for worship, but for acknowledgement. For the first time, modern medicine began to look back, not with mockery, but with awe. Anthropologists rediscovered that medieval witches had used willow bark long before chemists turned it into aspirin, that they had practiced sterilization with alcohol and vinegar before germs had names, that they had used lavender to calm, mint to ease digestion, chamomile to lower fever. The midwives had not been ignorant, they had been precise. Yet for every rediscovery, there was grief. For every new book, another forgotten name surfaced. For every triumph of memory, a reminder of how much had been lost. Museums began to exhibit the instruments once used against them, the chains, the masks, the branding irons. Scholars began to trace family lines and found that many modern nurses, midwives, and herbalists descended from villages where witch trials were held. History had not ended. It had simply hidden in the bloodline. But memory, once awakened, becomes its own medicine. Women began to gather not around fires of fear, but of creation. In art studios, in classrooms, in protests, they reclaimed the symbols of the witch. The broom as labor, the cauldron as chemistry, the herbs as science. The word witch became not an accusation, but an identity, a rebellion against the forgetting. Yet amid the pride, there was still sorrow, because remembrance is never clean. The deeper they dug, the more they unearthed the horror, the confessions carved from screams, the villages emptied of women, the children left behind. And through it all, one truth echoed. We were never monsters. We were mothers. By the late 20th century, the world began to listen. Universities introduced courses on gender and medicine. The midwife's profession was restored in law. Hospitals began to allow natural birth again, letting women labor as they once had, guided by their own breath, their own body, their own wisdom.
In some countries, midwives now wear white coats. In others, they still bring their own baskets of herbs and cloth, carrying both past and present. But wherever they work, they carry an unspoken oath: to remember.
The anatomy of the body can be studied, but the anatomy of memory, that belongs to them. It is carved in hands that still cradle the dying and welcome the newborn. It is sung in lullabies that sound like prayer. It is whispered in every hospital, every home, every place where life begins. The midwives were never truly burned. They were reborn, again and again, in the bodies of those who heal. They said the witch was gone, but every scientist knows shadows never disappear. They only change shape with the light. Welcome back, seekers of the forbidden. Tonight, we stand in the present, in the age of glowing screens and sterile laboratories, yet surrounded by the ghosts of the past. This is the science of shadows, the story of how the witches became scientists, the healers became researchers, and how the past still breathes through the microscopes of the modern world. The 21st century prides itself on reason. We map the genome, edit DNA, grow organs in glass, and name ourselves gods of biology. Yet in every act of creation, we echo the same impulse that once burned beneath the moon: to understand life by touching its mystery. We no longer call it magic. Now we call it data. But the lineage remains. Every laboratory, every university, every research hospital carries traces of the women who were once called witches. The midwives' herbal recipes have become pharmacology. Their whispered prayers over the sick have become psychotherapy. Their moonlit rituals of fertility have become endocrinology. They were the first to study the patterns of the body, its cycles, its blood, its strange, sacred logic. But history wrote them out, and so their descendants returned through another door, wearing lab coats instead of cloaks. They are the scientists, the biologists, the geneticists, the doctors, women who hold test tubes instead of herbs, who analyze instead of whisper, but who still serve the same ancient vow: to protect life.
And yet, even now, the old fear lingers. Women in medicine still find themselves dismissed, underpaid, and doubted. When they lead research, they are called ambitious. When they speak with conviction, emotional. When they challenge orthodoxy, radical. Centuries have passed since the flames, but the tone is the same. The language of doubt has evolved, but not the desire to silence. Still, the witches have learned a new kind of alchemy, the power of proof. In universities and laboratories, they reclaim the stories written against them. Historians trace the forgotten hands that first mixed willow bark into pain relievers. Archaeologists uncover amulets of bone that turn out to be early surgical tools. Geneticists discover that remedies once dismissed as superstition, honey, garlic, chamomile, possess measurable antibacterial power. Every discovery becomes an act of retribution. Every confirmation of an old remedy whispers, "You burned us for this." But perhaps the most haunting transformation is in the field of psychology. The hysteria that doctors once diagnosed in women, the illness blamed on their wandering wombs, is now recognized as trauma. The screams once dismissed as madness were memory. The trembling hands were grief. The witches had not been possessed, they had been broken by persecution. Now therapists call it intergenerational trauma. But long before the term existed, women knew how to treat it, through story, through touch, through community. In the new world of digital healing, mindfulness apps, holistic therapy, plant medicine retreats, echoes of the old rituals return. The same herbs, the same songs, the same circle of women sitting together beneath artificial light instead of firelight, speaking softly about pain, about healing, about hope. Science, after centuries of denial, has come full circle, back to empathy,
back to the body, back to the soul. The witches have returned. They do not wear pointed hats. They wear stethoscopes, glasses, headphones, badges with their names printed in plastic. They walk hospital halls, teach anatomy, write code for prosthetic limbs, study the chemical poetry of DNA. And though they no longer call it magic, every act of discovery hums with its rhythm. Because knowledge, like magic, is not power alone. It is responsibility. To know the body is to serve it, not to own it. To name life is to protect it, not to dissect it for profit. The science of shadows is the science of humility, the reminder that even in a world of data, there are still mysteries that resist measurement. Birth, death, love. The same three forces that the midwives once served. And so the circle closes. The witches who were once accused of knowing too much now teach the world how little it truly knows. The hands once bound in rope now hold scalpels and microscopes. The herbs once called unholy are studied in journals and patents. The fires that burned them have been replaced by the cold blue glow of research screens, another kind of flame, still dangerous, still consuming, but capable of illumination instead of destruction. In the hum of the lab, in the heartbeat of a hospital, in the flicker of a monitor, the past lives. Because every cure is an apology, every experiment is an echo, every breath of progress carries the scent of smoke. They said the witch's fire died centuries ago, but it never truly went out. It just changed form. Welcome back, seekers of the sacred and the silenced. Tonight we reach the final reckoning, the moment when history's ashes breathe again. This is The Fire Returns to Flesh, the story of how the voices once drowned in flame have returned through the mouths, minds, and hands of modern women. In the 21st century, the world tells itself that it no longer burns its witches. But the signs remain, not in fire, but in fear. Women still silenced in boardrooms, still dismissed in hospitals, still blamed for what they create, still punished for what they know. The pyres have become policies. The chains have become expectations. The smoke has become the air we breathe.
Yet something ancient stirs beneath this new world, a rebellion not of rage, but of remembrance. It begins in art studios and classrooms, in activist circles and laboratories. Painters, writers, and scholars begin to reclaim the imagery once used to condemn, the cauldron as chemistry, the broom as labor, the herbs as early medicine, the circle of women as community rather than conspiracy. Across Europe, exhibitions open with names like The Healer's Fire and Womb of the World. Paintings depict midwives standing in modern hospitals, their faces lit by both firelight and fluorescent light. Murals bloom on city walls, women with hands of flame, eyes of gold, and roots twined around ancient apothecary jars. In Germany, the descendants of those executed in Würzburg and Bamberg build memorials, not of stone, but of gardens. Each flower marks a name once erased, each herb planted where a pyre once stood. Thyme for courage, rosemary for remembrance, sage for cleansing. In Scotland, the Parliament issues a formal apology in 2022 to the thousands of women executed as witches. The motion passes with trembling voices and tearful eyes. It is not absolution. It is acknowledgement. In the Netherlands, students erect sculptures shaped like open hands, palms up, offering. In Italy, a university names its medical library after a woman burned in 1587, Maddalena di Ferrara, a midwife accused of demonic birth. The fire returns, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Everywhere, women reclaim the language once used to curse them. Witch becomes a word of pride, an emblem of defiance, knowledge, and resilience. Podcasts, novels, and films resurrect the untold stories. Historians uncover manuscripts where condemned women wrote not spells, but medical notes, remedies for childbirth, for infection, for despair. And in the realm of medicine itself, the cycle closes again. The modern midwife is no longer hunted. She is honored. Hospitals now train them. Governments license them. Universities award them degrees. Yet, beneath the white coats and sterile gloves, something timeless endures. The calm, patient strength of the women who once worked in candlelight.
A midwife in Norway holds a newborn and hums an old song her grandmother sang. She doesn't know that its melody matches one recorded in a 15th century witch trial. A nurse in Spain lights a candle in her ward every winter without knowing why, only that it feels right. A doctor in Poland keeps a sprig of rosemary on her desk for luck, unaware that it was once used to cleanse the air during childbirth. Memory moves through them like breath. And still, art carries the rebellion further. Films reimagine witches not as villains, but as visionaries. Dancers perform the births of stars and cities, merging science with ritual. Poets write of burning kindly, of turning the fire inward, letting it purify but not consume. The witch, reborn, is not just a woman. She is an idea, the embodiment of knowledge that refuses to die, the eternal warning that fear cannot erase truth. She lives in every protester holding a sign for bodily autonomy, in every researcher studying childbirth mortality to save the next generation, in every woman who dares to say, "I know," when the world tells her she shouldn't. The world still tries to silence her, through mockery, through law, through indifference. But her laughter now carries through microphones, her wisdom through code, her memory through film. Because fire has no shape, it only needs air. And air is everywhere. The fire that once devoured the midwives has returned to flesh, to movement, to art, to medicine, to voice. It burns not as destruction, but as illumination. And in the quiet moments between screens and machines, if you close your eyes and breathe deeply, you can still smell it, faintly, like herbs after rain. A reminder that the fire never left us. It simply moved inside.
No one remembers all their names. No one ever will. But their legacy was never meant to be carved in stone. It lives in blood, in birth, in hands that heal without fear. Every time a child draws their first breath, every time a woman chooses her own fate, every time a healer listens instead of condemns, the midwives are there. The fire is not gone. It waits in us, and it will never burn us again. They said time heals all wounds, but blood remembers what history forgets. Welcome back, seekers of memory and marrow. Tonight, we travel beyond the pyres, beyond the textbooks, into the invisible inheritance of pain and power. This is Ashes in the Blood, the story of how centuries of fear and fire still live inside us, passed down not through words, but through the quiet architecture of the body itself. The witch hunts are over, the midwives are honored, the apologies have been spoken, and yet something lingers. A tension in the chest when women speak too loudly, a flicker of doubt when they trust their instincts, a fear unexplainable of being seen or of being right. It is not superstition, it is survival memory.
Modern science calls it epigenetics, the way trauma can etch itself into the body's code, carried silently through generations. A grandmother's terror can echo in her granddaughter's heartbeat. A burned village can leave traces in the DNA of those never born there. The body, it seems, has its own memory, older than history, deeper than language. And so, the legacy of the witch fires endures not only in archives and folklore, but in us. For centuries, women learned to make themselves smaller, to speak softly, to hide their knowledge behind modest smiles. To survive, they became invisible. And invisibility, passed down long enough, becomes instinct. When a woman hesitates to call herself wise, when a girl apologizes before she speaks, when knowledge comes with guilt, these are the ghosts of the midwives whispering, "Be careful." Even now, in the most modern hospitals, a woman in labor is told to trust the doctor before she trusts her body. Even now, women are told that intuition is unscientific, though intuition once kept humanity alive when science had not yet been born. The witch hunts may have ended, but the hierarchy they built remains. And yet in this dark inheritance lies another kind of strength. The same endurance that kept women alive through centuries of silence has become their power. The same instinct that told them when birth was near, when illness approached, when danger stirred, it still hums beneath the surface. Because what was once called magic was never illusion, it was awareness. And awareness cannot be burned. Across the world, modern midwives now study both medicine and memory. In Iceland, women teach childbirth alongside ancestral rituals, drumming, breathing, humming low songs that match the rhythm of the body. In Kenya, traditional birth attendants work side by side with doctors, blending herbal wisdom with surgical precision. In Japan, nurses light incense in maternity wards, saying it calms the room, though none of them remember when that tradition began. It is the lineage of the forgotten, returning through instinct. Even in genetics labs, researchers studying inherited trauma find something haunting. The stress markers in descendants of persecuted peoples mirror those of their ancestors. Holocaust survivors, war refugees, famine victims, and yes, even the descendants of the witch trials. Their blood carries echoes of fear, but it also carries resilience.
Pain leaves fingerprints. So does survival. One cannot exist without the other. In recent years, psychologists have begun to speak of ancestral healing, the idea that by remembering, we repair. That by naming what happened, we set the body free from its silent inheritance. And so, once again, the act of remembering becomes medicine. History, it seems, was the first disease. Memory, the only cure. In one small village in Germany, where 34 women were burned in 1593, their descendants gather every autumn in the same square. They bring candles, not to mourn, but to light. Each flame is a symbol, not of sorrow, but of continuation. A young girl, no older than 12, stands before the crowd, holding a single candle. Her great-grandmother was a midwife. She says softly, They tried to erase us, but we were the ones who taught them how to be born. The crowd falls silent. For a moment, the air itself seems to shimmer. No smoke, no fire, only breath. Because the witch hunts were never only about the women who died. They were about the world's fear of its own dependence on them. Every man who lit a pyre still came from a woman's body. Every priest who condemned them was once delivered by their hands. The ultimate irony, that humanity burned the very ones who gave it life, cannot be undone. But it can be acknowledged. And that is what the descendants are doing now, not in revenge, but in reverence. Every birth attended by gentle hands, every daughter taught to trust her instincts, every healer who refuses to hide her light. All of these are acts of rebellion against the silence written into their blood. The ashes of the midwives are long cold, but their essence remains, circling through us like breath, unseen, unmeasured, alive. When you stand in sunlight and feel warmth on your skin, remember, that is the same warmth they felt before the flames took them. When you light a candle in mourning, remember, the fire no longer devours. It illuminates. When you take a breath, deep and defiant, remember, it is their breath still moving through time. They burned their bodies, but not their blood, and the blood remembers everything. They said the world was born from nothing. But what if the world was born from a woman's breath? Welcome back, wanderers of the flame. Tonight we step into the space where remembrance becomes creation, where the earth itself remembers the hands that once healed it. This is the womb of the world, the story of how healing, creation, and defiance became one. The body of the earth and the body of a woman have always shared the same language. Both bleed, both birth, both endure. And for thousands of years, the midwives of the world were fluent in both. They did not separate medicine from spirit, or nature from flesh. To them, the two were one. But when they were silenced, the world itself began to suffer. Forests burned, rivers ran sick, the soil turned bitter. Humanity, in its hunger for control, forgot the language of care. Men dissected the earth as they had dissected women, not to understand, but to own. And yet, beneath that cruelty, the old rhythm still beat. Every seed that pushes through soil, every tide that returns, every pulse in a newborn's wrist, it is the same force that once guided the midwives' hands. Creation, patient, and unstoppable. In the quiet corners of the 21st century, this truth begins to resurface. In the mountains of Italy, women plant gardens on the sites of old witch trials, herbs the same as those once forbidden, rosemary, rue, sage, mugwort. They say it is for beauty, but when they touch the leaves, they murmur the old words, the blessings their grandmothers never dared speak aloud. In Iceland, women gather at the edge of volcanoes to sing. The songs have no lyrics, only rhythm, like breath, like heartbeat. They say it helps the earth remember mercy. In Brazil, healers and botanists work together, studying the plants once dismissed as folk medicine. Many of them, it turns out, hold compounds capable of curing diseases modern chemistry cannot yet name. The scientists write papers. The women simply nod. We always knew, they say. The world is remembering its womb.
Everywhere, the act of healing returns to its original form, collaboration, not conquest. Science and spirit, reunited after centuries of exile. And through it all, the figure of the midwife, that ancient guardian of birth, rises again, no longer hunted, no longer hidden. She stands as a bridge between worlds, flesh and faith, logic and love, life and its endless renewal. She no longer wears the witch's mark or the healer's shawl. She wears whatever she chooses: scrubs, linen, bearskin, and her tools are many: her voice, her hands, her silence, her defiance. Because to heal in any age is an act of creation, and creation in any form is rebellion against death. There is a story told in Finland of an old woman who lived alone near the forest. They said she talked to trees, that the wind obeyed her, that she could stop the bleeding of a wound with her breath. When she died, her house burned by accident. But in the spring that followed, her field bloomed with thousands of red poppies. The villagers said it was a miracle. The scientists said it was seed dispersal. But both were right. Because life does not care about labels. It only cares about continuation. The witches understood that. The midwives embodied it. And the modern women who carry their spirit now give it new form. In laboratories, in classrooms, in art, in protest, in birth. The womb of the world is not a metaphor, it is a reminder that everything that exists came from the act of care. When a mother holds a child for the first time, she feels the weight of the world in her arms. When a healer holds a dying hand, she carries that same world, returning to it what it gave. Creation and release, birth and death, giving and letting go. That is the oldest rhythm, the one the midwives kept alive, even as the flames rose.
And now, that rhythm begins to return, stronger than before. In the great cities, where neon light once drowned out the stars, people turn back to the earth. They plant, they cook, they study herbs again, they listen. They call it sustainability, ecology, mindfulness. But in truth, it is something older. The relearning of reverence. The world itself is beginning to remember the women it burned. Because creation cannot exist without compassion, and compassion, like the earth, always finds its way home. In this remembering, the story of the witches transforms. They are no longer victims. They are the blueprint. The womb of the world was never empty. It was waiting for the hands that once healed it to return. They said they could build life from code, but even machines need a heartbeat to begin. Welcome back, listeners of the forgotten. Tonight, we leave the fires and forests behind and step into the age of glass and light, a world run by algorithms, where creation hums in servers instead of wombs, and birth is measured in data, not miracles. This is The Machine and the Moon, the story of how the ancient rhythm of life still haunts the cold hum of technology, and how the witch's legacy continues to whisper through the wires. The modern world believes it has conquered mystery. We can edit genes, print organs, predict illness before it begins. We speak of reproduction in laboratories and call it progress. But every time we reach for godhood, the moon still rises, soft, silent, reminding us that creation was never ours to own. In sterile rooms filled with humming machines, scientists grow embryos in glass spheres. The light glows cold and blue, like distant starlight. No midwives' hands, no heartbeat, no breath. Only data, temperature, numbers. They call it the future of birth. And yet, even here, the ghosts of the midwives linger. In the flicker of an incubator's pulse, you can almost see their shadow.
the outline of hands that once held life, not with gloves, but with love. In the rhythmic beep of a monitor, you can still hear the ancient song, the lullaby of women who delivered humanity before it knew the word science. Technology may have replaced touch, but it cannot erase its memory. The witch trials were about fear of the unknown, fear of women who could create life without permission. And now, centuries later, we stand in another age of creation, driven by machines instead of magic, and the same fear still hums beneath the surface.
We fear the natural, the messy, the unpredictable. We sanitize, sterilize, digitize. We build artificial wombs so that birth can happen without pain, without blood, without imperfection. But in erasing pain, we risk erasing empathy. Because what the midwives always understood, what the machines never will, is that life begins in chaos. It begins in the trembling, the breaking, the storm before the calm. Birth was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be real. And yet, in this new world of artificial creation, women still find ways to bring the sacred back. In Japan, robotic nurses assist in childbirth, but it is still a human woman who whispers encouragement, her voice cutting through the mechanical calm. In California, virtual reality programs simulate calm, birthing environments, soft light, ocean sounds, and behind the digital code, a developer adds a line of audio, a heartbeat recorded from her own child. In Iceland, hospitals project the moon on the ceiling during birth, a reminder that some things cannot be programmed. The witches would smile at that. They would recognize it instantly, the blending of tool and soul, of machine and moon. Because they too once used the tools of their time, herbs, knives, boiling water, chants, to serve the same purpose, to bring life into a frightened world. What has changed is not the act, but the attitude. Once, birth was ceremony, a gathering of breath and belief. Now, it is procedure, a checklist of efficiency. And yet, even in hospitals, you still find the flicker of the old ways. A midwife humming to calm a mother in pain. A nurse lighting a candle in the corner of a neonatal ward. A doctor closing his eyes for a moment before surgery, whispering something he cannot name. That something is the residue of reverence, the awareness that for all our control, we still stand on the edge of the unknown every time life begins. The witches would have understood that perfectly. They knew that creation was both divine and dangerous, that to bring life into the world was to face death and defy it, not once, but over and over.
And perhaps that is what the modern world has forgotten in its worship of machines, that the power to create is not a technical achievement, but a moral one. It requires compassion, risk, and surrender, the same ingredients that made the midwives heretics and heroes. In laboratories, scientists look at DNA, the code of life, and marvel at its precision. But even in that code, there is mystery. Between every strand of logic, there is silence, the unmeasurable hum that binds everything together. The witches called it spirit. We call it energy, instinct, intuition. But whatever the name, it is the same, and the moon still rules it. The moon, that silent witness above every birth, every ritual, every fire, the one light that has seen it all. It watched the midwives burned, it watched the doctors rise, it watches us now through the neon haze of cities that have forgotten to look up. But she is still there, silver, constant, unblinking. The witches drew strength from her cycles. Now, scientists use her gravity to measure tides, sleep, mood, fertility. Different language, same truth. The machine and the moon, logic and mystery, have always needed each other. And if the witches taught us anything, it is that life thrives not in purity, but in balance. We can build machines to mimic creation, but we still need hands to hold what they make.
They said the witches were evil. But when the smoke cleared, the world saw its own reflection in the ashes. Welcome back, listeners of the truth that refuses to die. Tonight, we step into the final reflection, the one that cannot be avoided. This is the mirror and the flame, the moment when humanity faces what it burned and what it became. For centuries, the world told one story, that the witches were sinners, that the fire was justice, that purity demanded sacrifice. But time, patient and merciless, has polished the mirror of history until the truth shines through. When we look into it now, we do not see monsters. We see ourselves. The witch hunts were never only about superstition or faith. They were a mirror, reflecting our fear of difference, our hunger for control, our need to destroy what we cannot understand. Every pyre, every confession, every scream was a reflection of humanity's darkest instinct, to protect power by erasing empathy. And that instinct is not gone. The flames have changed shape, no longer burning bodies, but reputations, identities, truths. The torches are digital now, the mobs online instead of in the square. But the rhythm is familiar. Accusation, outrage, silence. The mirror remains. In its glass, we see that the world still struggles with the same fear. The fear of women who know too much, who speak too freely, who refuse to be owned. We see it in every headline that mocks, every courtroom that questions, every system that doubts. But the reflection has shifted, because this time the women are not running. They are standing before the mirror, unflinching, holding its gaze.
Artists turn the image of the witch into a symbol of resistance. Poets write in her voice. Filmmakers retell her story not as horror, but as history. In classrooms, children learn that the witch trials were not the end of an era. They were the beginning of a silence that lasted centuries. And now, that silence is breaking. In Spain, a collective of women installs a mirror in the plaza where the last witch was burned. On its surface are etched the words, "Look, she looks back." People walk past and see their own faces reflected where her ashes once fell. For some, it is unsettling. For others, liberating. For all, unforgettable. The mirror teaches what the flames never could, that the capacity for cruelty and compassion lives in the same heart, that every era has its witch hunt, that every civilization tests its conscience by how it treats the ones who dare to heal. The fire purified nothing. It only illuminated the truth. In psychology, they speak of collective trauma, the way nations inherit their own sins. In art, they call it atonement, but in the language of the witches, it has another name, transformation. Because the flame that once destroyed can also cleanse. The same fire that burned their bodies now lights the world that remembers them.
Every act of truth is a spark. Every apology, every story retold, every hand held in remembrance, these are the flames of rebirth. In Poland, a sculptor forges a bronze figure of a woman holding both a torch and a mirror. Her face is neither young nor old, beautiful nor monstrous. She is both the healer and the haunted. The inscription reads, "We carry the fire, but now it warms." That is the final transformation. The witch, once feared, has become the symbol of empathy. The flame that consumed her now fuels the march toward understanding. The mirror that accused her now reflects her strength.
Humanity's oldest wound, its war against its own mothers, has begun to close. But scars, like mirrors, never lie. They remind us of what we were, and what we might become again if we forget. The midwives, the healers, the women of fire, they have returned not to seek vengeance, but to remind the world of balance. Fire and water, science and soul, creation and destruction, all belong together, as they always did. Because the lesson of the witches is not never burn again. It is never forget why you did. The mirror reflects, the flame reveals, and together they teach us that every act of creation carries the shadow of its opposite. That to bring life into the world, to heal, to love, to teach, is always to defy something that prefers silence. The witches were never enemies of God. They were mirrors for humanity's fear and its potential for grace. And perhaps that is why their story endures. Because every time we light a candle, we reenact the same paradox, holding destruction and illumination in the same trembling flame. We hold the mirror. We face ourselves. And for once, we do not look away.
They said the story was over, but stories like this do not end. They return. Welcome back, seekers of the eternal. Tonight, the fire burns low, and we stand at the edge of all things, where endings fold into beginnings, and silence hums with memory. This is the circle unbroken, the final chapter of the witch's story, the midwives' legacy, and the long, patient triumph of truth. The circle has always been the witch's shape. The moon, the womb, the ring of hands around a birthing bed, the cycle of seasons, the breath between life and death. It is not a symbol of confinement, but of connection. When the flames consumed them, the church thought the circle had been broken, but the women knew better. For every name erased from record, another survived in a lullaby. For every body burned, a daughter was born. For every silence forced, a voice learned to sing again. The circle never ends, it widens. Now, centuries later, the same earth that once smelled of smoke smells of rosemary again. The same moon that watched their deaths still glows over newborns being delivered by hands that no longer hide. The same elements, fire, air, earth, water, continue their ancient work, whispering to those who still listen. In the hospitals of the modern world, machines hum and lights glare, but in every room where life begins, there is still the same moment of awe, the same hush before a cry. That pause, that heartbeat of silence before sound, is the echo of the circle. The witches would recognize it instantly. The world has learned much, but forgotten more. It has conquered disease, but not cruelty. It has built miracles of metal and light, but still struggles to honor the sacredness of touch.
And so the witches return, not in flesh but in spirit, in the hands of doctors who choose compassion over profit,
in the voices of activists who fight for choice and dignity, in the quiet strength of mothers who birth without apology. They are the breath before discovery, the spark before rebellion, the whisper before truth. Some say humanity has evolved beyond myth, but myths are not false. They are memory wearing metaphor. The story of the witch is the story of every being who dared to know, to heal, to question, and paid for it. And every time we face injustice, we stand once more at the edge of that same fire. The question never changes. Will we burn or will we learn? In the streets of modern Europe, candlelight vigils glow for the women lost to the flames, not as ghosts, but as guides. The chants that rise are soft but steady, not of vengeance, but of promise. We remember. We continue. We are the circle. Some carry banners with a single line. She who was burned walks with us still. And perhaps she does, because the fire that once devoured her now burns in us, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Because her hands, once tied, have become the hands that heal, right, and rebuild. Because her silence has become our song. The story began with smoke, it ends with light. In the rhythm of a newborn's cry, in the breath of a dying prayer, in the whisper of leaves stirred by unseen wind, the circle holds. The witches are gone, but they are everywhere. The midwives are forgotten, but they are eternal. The fire is cold, but its glow remains, flickering across every face that dares to remember. They are not history. They are inheritance. The world was born from their courage, and it will be healed by their memory. The circle is unbroken. The hands are joined again, and the fire, at last, belongs to us.